Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2 humanities. If you'd like to get a piece of paper and a pencil, you can follow along and take Cornell notes. It's not required, but it is great practice for you. So if you'd like to, go ahead. All right, let's start with our first topic, which is Christian missionaries sent to evangelize Britain. So in 500 CE or AD, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, which were 3 Germanic tribes, were in control of eastern Britain. So the Christian church decided to send missionaries to evangelize what they called the barbarians. And if you remember from last week, barbarians were considered to be anybody who was not Roman. So St. Ninian is considered to be one of the first missionaries in Scotland, and St. Patrick, whose name you might recognize, was one of the first in Ireland. So St. Patrick of Ireland is one of the world's most popular saints, and that is because we celebrate his death on March 17th every year as St. Patrick's Day. He led a very eventful life. At 16 years old, he was carried off into captivity by the Irish, and he was sold as a slave. So he spent the next 6 years tending sheep and herding sheep and learning the language of the people of that area, which was the Celts. So he learned Celtic. Finally, he escaped and was taken by sailors back to his homeland of Britain, where he was reunited with his family. While he was back in his homeland, he decided to become a priest or a bishop, and then returned to Ireland after dreaming that the Irish people were calling him to convert them to Christianity. So he returned to Ireland and spent the next 40 years preaching Christianity. There are some legends about St. Patrick. One of them is that he banished all of the snakes from Ireland by standing on a hill and using a wooden staff to drive them into the sea. Another legend is that he used the shamrock to explain the Christian idea of the Trinity. And that is part of the reason why we use a shamrock to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Christian missionaries during this time continued to try to convert the people of this area, including the Pict tribe of southern Scotland. St. Columba was an Irish missionary who went to Scotland and worked with these people. He also founded a monastery at Iona, which became an important religious and political center for many years after that. And during the 6th and 7th centuries, so for several hundred years after that, Christianity continued to spread across Scotland and across this area. All right, so our second topic you probably also will be familiar with, and that is the legend of King Arthur. So during ancient times, stories were told orally, and that means that they were told from one person to another out loud. And so one person would tell a story, another person would hear that story, and then go on and tell that story to another person, and that's how stories were passed down. In the Middle Ages, that changed, and authors started to write stories down, and that's how the story of King Arthur came to us. And the story of King Arthur is called a legend and not a myth, because legends are a combination of facts and fiction, and nobody's completely sure how much of that story might be fact and how much of it might be fiction. A myth is something that is fictional and usually has kind of some supernatural elements to it, gods and heroes, and they're meant to teach things that are important to a certain culture. So you guys might remember the Greek myths that we studied last year, and that's a good example of that. So this story has the protagonist, King Arthur. He's the main person that the story is about, and he was born to a king named Uther Pendragon. And when he was a baby, his life was in danger, so he was given to Merlin the magician. And then Merlin gave him to a foster family who raised him, and he didn't know that he was the son of a king. But when he was a teenager, he pulled a sword out of a stone that nobody else could pull out. And some people say that that sword was called Excalibur. But there are different versions of the story. So some versions of the story say that he did pull that sword out of the stone, but that wasn't Excalibur. Later on, a fairy called the Lady of the Lake lifted her hand out of the water and held a sword up for him to get, and that sword was Excalibur. So there's different versions of this story. According to the story, King Arthur married Guinevere and he held court at a castle named Camelot. Um, and he had knights that were loyal to him, and they all sat around a great big round table and became known, and because of this, they became known as the Knights of the Round Table. So this was a really important idea because none of the knights were closer to the king or further away from the king, which meant that they were all equal distances from each other. So they were all equal. And that was a kind of one of the early ideas of democracy and everybody being having an equal amount of power. So some of the more famous knights of the Round Table were Sir Lancelot, who was the most chivalrous, Sir Galahad, who was the most noble, and Sir Percival, who was the most innocent. Mordred was the son of King Arthur, and he is the antagonist. He was the bad guy. So he betrays Arthur. Arthur's wounded in a battle with him, and then his body gets sent to the island of Avalon, where he's healed, and then according to legend, he'll return to rule again at some point. Another part of the legend of King Arthur is the quests that knights would go on. One of those quests was for the Holy Grail, which was the cup that's said to be used by Jesus at the Last Supper. Only the pure in heart could see the Grail. And because knights lived by a code of chivalry and considered themselves to always try to be pure and honest and the very best that they could be, they believed that they could see it. And so they went on a quest to find that. So, was Arthur a real person? That's where we get into the idea of fact versus fiction. So, most of the elements of Arthur's story are fiction, but there is a king named Arthur that lived in Britain during 4 to 500 CE, who was the leader of the Celts. He led a great war against the Saxons, and then he was killed in battle. Um, uh, After he was killed in battle, his people fled to England and France and told stories about his bravery and his goodness. And eventually, he was remembered as a hero. So that probably is the factual part of this story. But in the 1100s, storytellers started telling more fictional parts of this story, and they described King Arthur and his men as knights. Arthur would have lived before the period of knights. But because during the 1100s and this time period, knights were considered to be the ideal kind of man, so they told this story with King Arthur and his men being knights. Um, Knights at this time rode horses, they carried swords, they wore armor, they followed a code of chivalry that was to be brave, honorable, generous, courteous to ladies. And so storytellers of this time used those important things for their time period and added those to the story of King Arthur. All right, so let's move on to topic 3. Topic 3 is Shapur II, rules at the height of the Sassanid Empire. So as part of our studies of last year, we studied Alexander the Great. Some of you might remember some of his story, but part of the area that he conquered was Persia and Babylon. And after he died, several of his generals who were Greek took over, and they ruled for about 100 years. But after they after that, then there was a Persian tribe called the Parthians who overthrew them and established the Parthian Empire. So the Parthians expanded that empire, and they move on here. The Parthians expanded that empire, and they actually were friendly with the Chinese Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, and together they made the Silk Route an official trade route between those two empires, and they both grew prosperous from trade, the trade that allowed. Another interesting fact about the Parthians is that they were excellent horsemen and archers. They had a tactic where they would twist around on their horses and throw arrows into the enemy lines while they were galloping away. And so the Romans that they fought called that tactic the Parthian shot. Another interesting thing about the Parthians is that their soldiers carried a kind of bread that was really similar to what we know as biscotti. And this bread was really hard and crispy and probably baked twice so that it would last a long time. Another thing about the Parthians was that they followed a religion called Zoroastrianism, and the main god of this religion was Ahura Mazda. But even though that was their main religion, they were still really tolerant towards other religions. In 225 CE, Ardashir the first overthrew the Parthians and began the Sassanid Empire. So his son, Shapur I, was the second king of the Sassanid Empire, and his claim to fame is that he defeated the Romans at the Battle of Edessa and was the first foreign ruler to capture a Roman emperor in battle. He captured the Emperor Valerian. And Shapur II was not his son, but he was in his line. But Shapur II holds the distinction of being the longest reigning monarch in Iranian history because he actually became the king before he was even born, or so they say. So there was several kings in power, and the people around the ruler didn't like the things that they were doing. So they decided to try to control who became the ruler after that. And so they murdered Hormizd the second's oldest son. They blinded his second son. They imprisoned his third son. But finally, the fourth son, they crowned because they thought that if they crowned him before he was even born, then they could control the way that the country went. And so they ruled until he was 16. But at that time, then he took control and he became the 10th king of the Sassanid Empire. So he was called the warrior king because he fought several wars with Rome, and had a lot of strength in military strategy and diplomacy, and actually brought about what is considered to be the golden age of the Sassanid Empire. However, up until this point, there had been a lot of religious tolerance, even though Zoroastrianism was still the main religion. They were really tolerant towards all the other religions in the area: Christianity, Buddhism, and Jewish people. All of those people were welcome and were not persecuted. However, Shapur II did decide to persecute Christians as a reaction to Rome, because Rome had just made Christianity the official religion. And so he wanted to counteract that. And so he began persecuting Christians. He also defeated Armenia and tried to force Zoroastrianism on that country. But there was a lot of conflict between Rome, and so there was a power struggle, and eventually a revolt. The Sassanid Empire lasted until 651 CE, when that empire ended with the conquest of Arabia and the adoption of Islam. All right, those are our history topics for this week. I hope you learned something interesting, and I will see you next week.